You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 324 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we used the last episode to shift our focus north of the Chambersburg Pike and look at the short but fierce fight there between Davis's Confederates and Cutler's Federals.
Davis's 1,700 Mississippians and North Carolinians descended like an avalanche on the 1,000 New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians of Cutler's brigade, who had rushed to deploy their north of the railroad cut. And by the end of the last show, that entire right end of the Federal line north of the Chambersburg Pike had collapsed, with the Union infantry and Hall's battery having been driven from the field by the attacking rebels.
But fortunately for the Yankees, Davis's Confederates were almost as disorganized by victory as they were by defeat. When Cutler's two remaining regiments, the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn, which had been positioned facing west around the McPherson Farm buildings just south of the Chambersburg Pike, saw that the right flank of the division line, over north of the road, was collapsing, they turned to their right, aligning along the pike and firing across the road into Davis's Confederates.
They were soon joined by the 6th Wisconsin, and bonus points if you remember that the 6th was part of the Iron Brigade, but had been held back as the divisional reserve, and so didn't actually take part in the Iron Brigade's fight for the Herbst woodlot.
In any case, what we're going to look at in this show is the fight at the railroad cut, and how the 6th Wisconsin, along with the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn, made a daring charge that dramatically turned the tables on Davis's victorious Confederates.
As Rich said just a moment ago, Cutler's two regiments south of the Chambersburg Pike were the 95th New York and the 84th New York. As you may have already picked up on, the latter preferred to be called by its original militia designation, the 14th Brooklyn.
In accordance with John Reynolds' desire to extend the Federal line on McPherson's Ridge as far northward as possible from the Iron Brigade's position in the Herbst woodlot, Cutler had peeled off two of his 5 regiments, the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn, around the McPherson Farm buildings, in order to link up with the Iron Brigade's right and fill in the space between the woods and the Chambersburg Pike. Hall's battery had dropped trail just on the other side of the road, and beyond Hall's guns, Cutler had rushed into place his 3 remaining regiments, the 76th New York, 56th Pennsylvania, and 147th New York.
In the last episode, we looked at the fate of Cutler's 3 regiments north of the road and saw how they, along with Hall's battery, were driven off the field by the attack of Davis's Confederates.
But we also said that fortunately for the Federals, Davis's rebels were almost as disorganized by victory as they, the Yankees, were by defeat. And this, along with the fact that south of the Chambersburg Pike, Archer's brigade was smashed by the Iron Brigade, it'll allow the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn to turn and confront the danger looming north of the road.
Hopefully, from what we've already said, y'all understand that when Cutler's brigade was deploying, it was split apart, with 3 regiments north of the Chambersburg Pike and the 2 regiments south of it, but with Cutler himself with the units over north of the road. That meant the portion of the brigade south of the road, around the McPherson farm buildings, was under the command of the senior colonel there, and that was Colonel Edward Fowler of the 14th Brooklyn.
The 14th Brooklyn deployed with the Herbst Woodlot to its immediate left, while the 95th New York went into line to its right, near the farm buildings and the road. Both regiments faced west, looking across a wheat field that sloped down toward Willoughby Run. As the 2 regiments got into position, they were fired on by some of Archer's rebels to their front and also in the woods to their left. This fire was likely from rebel skirmishers from the 5th Alabama Battalion, and in the trees over on the northern edge of the Herbst Woodlot, Confederate infantrymen from the 7th Tennessee. Several Federal soldiers were hit, and Colonel Fowler's horse was shot, and the New Yorkers returned the annoying enemy fire, but it was the charge of the Iron Brigade that actually drove off the rebels.
However, even after the retreat of Archer's Confederates, the men of the 2 New York regiments realized, with some surprise, that they were still taking fire, but this time from their rear. That fire was coming from some of Davis's rebels, who, having routed the rest of Cutler's brigade and Hall's battery there north of the Chambersburg Pike, had turned their attention to the Federals they could see across the road to the south.
But with the threat from Archer's Confederates south of the road having vanished, Fowler was able to maneuver the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn to deal with this new danger looming north of the road from Davis's rebels. And so Fowler ordered the 2 regiments to move back and pivot so that they were facing north. That is, he turned them 90 degrees so they would be facing the road and facing Davis's Confederates across the way.
Keep in mind that by this time, command and control in Davis's brigade had significantly deteriorated, as 2 out of 3 regimental commanders were down, and without a firm guiding hand from above, subordinate officers had started to take matters into their own hands.
As Joe Davis lost control of his brigade, some companies had scattered in pursuit of the Yankees retreating toward Sheed's Woods, while others had maneuvered to box in the beleaguered 147th New York, and still others had went after the vulnerable guns of Hall's battery. A Mississippian admitted the brigade became, quote, jumbled together without regard to regiment or company. So all of that's to say that it was probably elements from all 3 Confederate regiments, the 42nd Mississippi, 2nd Mississippi, and 55th North Carolina, that were firing on the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn from north of the Chambersburg Pike. So, of the players that have a role in this next scene in our drama, that means everyone is accounted for, except the 6th Wisconsin. Well, where are they?
The 6th Wisconsin had been the last regiment in the Iron Brigade's march column, and rather than helping clear Archer's Confederates out of the Herbst Woodlot, the 6th had been kept behind at the seminary as the divisional reserve.
The commander of the 6th Wisconsin, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes, was the great-grandson of William Dawes, who rode with Paul Revere to warn the Massachusetts countryside that the British regulars had marched from Boston, leading to the first shots of the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord in 1775. Here, in the Civil War, Rufus Dawes had entered the 6th Wisconsin as a captain in 1861. Then, as a major, had taken command of the regiment during the fierce fighting at Antietam when the colonel was hit. and then in March 1863, Dawes had been promoted to lieutenant colonel. He led the 6th during the Chancellorsville campaign, during which he led a river crossing under fire below Fredericksburg on April 29th.
Here at Gettysburg on July 1st, as Dawes awaited further orders, he was approached by Lieutenant Lloyd Harris, who that day was in command of the brigade guard of 100 men composed of 20 men from all 5 regiments of the Iron Brigade. When Harris asked what he should do with the men of the brigade guard, Dawes told him to attach them to the 6th Wisconsin, to split his men into 2 ad hoc companies of 50 men apiece, and if, or more likely when, they were called into action, to place 1 detachment on each flank of the 6th.
Counting the brigade guard, Dawes had about 420 men. It wasn't long before Lieutenant Meredith Jones from Abner Doubleday's staff, and remember, Doubleday had just taken over command from the just fallen John Reynolds, but Jones galloped up and told Dawes, "General Doubleday directs that you move your regiment at once to the right, and go like hell."
As Dawes ordered his men to set off at the double quick, another staff officer rode up to breathlessly report that the rebels north of the pike were, quote, driving Cutler's men.
Looking ahead, Dawes could see with his own eyes the seriousness of the situation. Hall's battery was scampering hurriedly to the rear, while Cutler's troops north of the Chambersburg pike were, according to Dawes, quote, manifestly in full retreat.
As the column of panting, sweating Federal soldiers rushed up to the wooden fence that bordered the road, Dawes ordered his regiment and the brigade guard to form into line of battle there along the fence, facing north. A bullet struck Dawes' horse, throwing him to the ground, but the men cheered as he scrambled to his feet. His mare pluckily struggled to her feet as well and hobbled off the field.
Once they were arrayed along the post and rail fence, Dawes ordered his men to rest their muskets on the fence rails and open fire by file on the rebels over across the way to the north of the pike. This severe rolling fire hurt the Confederates and, according to Dawes, quote, mixed up the enemy's line considerably.
The Confederates, stung by the sharp fire from south of the road, rushed to the shelter of the nearby railroad cut. The Federals were unaware of the presence of the cut, and one Wisconsin officer later remembered thinking that it was as if, quote, presto, their whole line disappeared as if swallowed up by the earth.
Okay, so we've mentioned the railroad cut a number of times by this point and said it was just to the north of the Chambersburg Pike and paralleled the pike, but just what was this railroad cut, Tracy?
Well, Rich, in the late 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad planned to extend a line of track from Harrisburg to Hanover, with the spur to Gettysburg and points west. However, the financial panic of 1857 stalled the project, and while the bed for the spur line west of Gettysburg had been finished, the company hadn't actually laid any tracks there at the time of the battle. So this is why you sometimes see or hear it referred to as the unfinished railroad cut.
The unfinished railroad cut was actually a series of cuts that carved through the rolling high ground there on the western outskirts of Gettysburg. Today's Park Road, Reynolds Avenue, crosses over what's known as the Middle Cut, while the Western Cut slices through the western arm of McPherson's Ridge, and the Eastern Cut carves through Seminary Ridge. The railroad bed didn't appear on any map, so its presence came as a surprise to commanders on both sides.
Lashed by the well-aimed musket fire of the Federals to the south of the Chambersburg Pike, Davis's Confederates north of the road rushed to the Middle Cut, which seemed to offer the security of a good, ready-made trench. But it actually proved to be of limited defensive value because except at each end, where it was shallowest, The cut itself was much too deep for a man to use as a trench, and its sides were too steep for anyone to stand on and be able to easily load and fire without slipping and sliding down the embankment.
Rufus Dawes wasn't aware of any of this, of course. All he knew was that the Confederates across the way had dropped out of sight, and, as one Wisconsin soldier later recalled, quote, "They opened a tremendous fire on us." Unable to simply stand in the open under such fire, and unwilling to fall back, the black hats of the 6th Wisconsin clambered over or wriggled through the fence lining the south side of the Chambersburg Pike, and then knocked down most of the one on the other side of the road. Their line of battle then pushed slowly into the open ground between the pike and the railroad bed, firing and loading as they stubbornly advanced, step by bloody step, toward the enemy.
Sometime around this point, Dawes apparently became aware that the 95th New York was to his left, and although he couldn't see them, and so at the time was unaware of their presence, the 14th Brooklyn was also coming up to the road, over on the other side of, or to the left of the 95th. That meant a formidable force of nearly 900 Federals was assembling there along the Chambersburg Pike, ready to take the fight to Davis's jumble of Confederates across the way.
Dawes spotted Major Edward Pye, who appeared to be leading the 95th New York, and rushed over to him. "We must charge," Dawes shouted over the tremendous noise of battle. Pye agreed. "Charge it is," he replied. Dawes ran back to his men and yelled as loud as he could, "Forward! Double quick! Charge!" Waving his sword in the air, Major Pye gave the same command to the 95th. The New Yorkers clambered over the turnpike fences, then surged across the open ground toward the railroad cut, a short distance to the left and to the rear of the 6th Wisconsin. The 14th Brooklyn took some time to complete its advance to the road, and so jumped off to the attack after the 95th. That meant the Federal charge swept forward en echelon, with each regiment charging one after the other from right to left. First the 6th Wisconsin, then the 95th New York, and then the 14th Brooklyn.
The 6th Wisconsin and the Brigade Guards surged forward. Men went down by the dozens, and wounded by the score staggered to the rear, but there was no pause. Dawes kept shouting over and over, "A line on the colors! Close up on the colors! A line on the colors!"
The colors themselves were shot down several times, but each time they fell, they were taken up by another member of the color guard and carried forward. Every man in the 6th Wisconsin's color guard was killed or wounded. Dawes later said that the once straight line became a, quote, V-shaped crowd of men with the colors at the point, moving hurriedly and firmly forward, while the whole field behind was streaming with men plunging in agony to the rear or sinking in death upon the ground.
It was 175 paces to the railroad cut, and in that space 180 of Dawes' men were killed or wounded. When the 6th was about 50 yards from the rebels, the enemy fire suddenly slackened, and the black-hatted veterans knew that the Confederates would, in just a moment, unleash a deadly close-range volley. It crashed out at them when they were only about 15 feet from the cut, and it seemed to Sergeant George Fairfield that it knocked down, quote, half our men.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics. We go back to source materials in their original languages.
And we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
As the momentum of their charge carried them forward, those Federals still on their feet after that devastating Confederate volley made a final, mad dash for the railroad cut and the enemy soldiers it sheltered.
Among those who fell during the charge of the 6th Wisconsin and the Brigade Guard was Private Richard Sleepy Dick Marston. He was known as a good soldier, but one who required an unusual amount of sleep. In fact, he had fallen asleep on picket duty on the night of June 30th and was placed under arrest. Lieutenant Harris, his company commander, knew that although it was very unlikely, Marston could be shot for his offense. So on the morning of July 1st, Harris pleaded Marston's case to Dawes, then to Iron Brigade Commander Solomon Meredith, and right up to Division Commander James Wadsworth. Thanks to Harris's intervention, Marston was released from arrest and allowed to enter the battle alongside his comrades. He was killed at the railroad cut.
Another who fell was Corporal James Kelly of the 6th Company B. He was shot in the chest during the charge, and seeing Dawes close by, Kelly turned to him, opened his shirt to show him the bloody hole made by the wound, and asked Dawes to write his parents and tell them he died a soldier. Dawes promised he would do it, and then turned away to continue hurrying forward. Later at 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dawes penciled in his notebook, quote, "If I am killed today, let it be known that Corporal James Kelly of Company B, shot through the breast and mortally wounded, asked to tell his folks he died like a soldier."
As the momentum of the Yankees' charge carried them right up to the cut, Dawes' men now pointed their muskets down at the frantically reloading rebels and demanding their surrender. As the Federal soldiers lined the lip of the railroad cut, the tables had turned, and the cut was now a trap for the Confederates who had sought its shelter.
The 6th Adjutant, Lieutenant E.P. Brooks, led a detachment of perhaps 20 men over to the east end of the railroad cut, lined them up across its mouth, and started firing down the length of the railroad bed into the packed mass of rebels. All along the cut, the black hats yelled, "Throw down your muskets! Throw down your muskets!" And dozens of trapped Confederates, despairing of escape, did just that and raised their hands in surrender.
Rufus Dawes later said that, as he stood at the edge of the cut where it was about 4 feet deep, looking down at the rebels in front of him, quote, "I shouted, 'Where is the colonel of this regiment?' An officer in gray with stars on his collar, who stood among the men in the cut, said, 'Who are you?'"
This was Major John Blair of the 2nd Mississippi. Dawes continues his account, quote, "I said, 'I am commander of this regiment. Surrender, or I will fire on you.' The officer replied not a word, but promptly handed me his sword, and all his men who still held them threw down their muskets. The fighting around the rebels' colors had not entirely ceased when this surrender was demanded. I took the sword. It would have been a handsome thing to say, 'Keep your sword, sir. But I was new to such occasions, and when 6 other officers came up and handed me their swords, I took them also, and held the awkward bundle in my arms until relieved by Adjutant Brooks.
In that account by Rufus Dawes that we just shared, he mentions, quote, the fighting around the rebel colors, end quote. This was the savage fight for the colors of the 2nd Mississippi, which took place about 20 or so yards to the right of the spot where Dawes accepted Major Blair's surrender.
We've talked before on the podcast about the importance of its colors to a regiment. From the very first, those silk banners were as much a part of a Civil War regiment as the soldiers themselves. Most Union regiments carried 2 flags, the national flag, the Stars and Stripes, and then a state flag, while most Confederate regiments carried just 1 flag, which at Gettysburg would have been the rebel battle flag that people are most familiar with, sometimes called the Southern Cross.
The flags came to represent home, duty, and cause to Union and Confederate soldiers. The flags were always with the men, on the drill field, on the march, and always in battle. The colors were carried in the center of a regiment's line of battle because it was their movement, more than the shouted commands of officers, that directed the soldiers, since shouted commands were often not heard amidst the terrific noise of battle. The banners served to lead a charge or rally a broken regiment.
Given the importance of a regiment's colors, it was not by chance that soldiers often singled out enemy color bearers for careful aim. Carrying the colors was a signal honor, but also an extremely hazardous duty. When men said the post of honor was the post of danger, it was no exaggeration. The color bearer was usually a hand-picked sergeant. The sole responsibility of the color guard, usually a detail of 6 to 8 corporals, was to protect the color bearer and to take up the flag should he fall. As we said just a few moments ago, during the 6th Wisconsin's charge on the railroad cut, every member of the regiment's color guard was killed or wounded.
It's hard for us today to understand, but it's important to always keep in mind that for a Civil War soldier, there was no honor greater than capturing an enemy flag. And the flip side of that, of course, was that there was no greater shame than for a regiment to lose its colors in battle. And so what we'll see at Gettysburg is that over and over again, there are instances of almost unbelievable bravery as men seek to capture an enemy flag or else defend their own colors.
As the 6th Wisconsin had neared the railroad cut, the colors of the 2nd Mississippi attracted a lot of attention. Apparently, Private Charles Murphy, the color bearer, had stuck the flag's staff in the ground at the lip of the cut in front of the regiment. As they dashed forward, a single-minded desire took hold of some Federals to capture this rebel flag that had waved defiantly from the edge of the railroad cut throughout their charge.
A fierce struggle took place as soldiers clubbed, bayoneted, and shot one another at close range. In the brutal melee that swirled around the 2nd Mississippi's flag, no 2 men saw what happened just the same, so their accounts vary. But Corporal Murphy himself later recalled how, quote, "My color guards were all killed or wounded in less than 5 minutes, and also my colors were shot more than a dozen times, and the flagstaff was hit and splintered 2 or 3 times. Just about that time, a squad of soldiers made a rush for my colors, and our men did their duty. They were all killed or wounded, but they still rushed for the colors in one of the most deadly struggles that was ever witnessed in any battle in the war. They still kept rushing for my flag, and there were over a dozen shot down like sheep in their madly rush for the colors, and then a large man made a rush for me and the flag. As I tore the flag from the staff, he took hold of me and the color. The firing was still going on and kept up for a few minutes after the flag was taken from me."
Lieutenant William Remington of the 6th was one of the Federals who made a try for the rebel flag. He was wounded in the neck and shot in the shoulder before deciding that was enough of that. Of his experience, he later admitted, quote, "Flag taking was pretty well knocked out of me."
Private Jasper Donglass of the 2nd Wisconsin, a member of the Brigade Guard, along with drummer Louis Eggleston and Private Cornelius Oakey, all went after the flag at the same time. Confederates wounded Oakey and Johnson and killed Eggleston.
In his book, Gettysburg, the First Day, Harry Fans writes, "Corporal Frank Waller had not planned to try to take the flag, but he saw it near at hand and went for it. Waller jerked it from the color bearer's hand, but he made no mention of it being on or off the staff. Waller thought he was able to seize it because the man had been wounded, but perhaps he was wrong in this because Murphy said nothing of being shot. Waller thought first of carrying the flag to the rear, where it could not be retaken, but he thought better of this. Instead, he threw the flag to the ground and stood on it as he loaded and fired twice before the firing stopped. He was not aware of it, perhaps, but his brother Sam, who was nearby, saw a rebel taking aim at him and parried the man's rifle with his own. Then he killed the man with his rifle butt." Frank Waller wrote also that a man from the 14th Brooklyn tried to take the flag from him as he was standing on it, but the man stopped when Waller threatened to shoot him. After the fighting ended, he turned the flag over to Lieutenant Colonel Dawes.
The charge of the 3 Federal regiments resulted in an abrupt and stunning turnaround to the fighting north of the Chambersburg Pike. Besides the flag of the 2nd Mississippi, by Rufus Dawes' count, there were 7 officers and 225 men captured by the 6th Wisconsin and the Brigade Guard. On Dawes' left, the 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn took an unknown number of prisoners, but many Confederates were able to escape out the western end of the railroad cut before the New Yorkers joined Dawes' men at the cut.
The cost of the victory hadn't come cheaply. Although exact casualty figures are difficult to pin down, the Federals' total was probably around 300 to 340 men for all 3 regiments, with the 6th Wisconsin and Brigade Guard accounting for the heaviest loss with 180. The Confederates also suffered heavy losses, and while exact numbers aren't known, Davis's brigade is estimated to have lost about 600 men in the fighting there north of the Pike.
It was now probably sometime close to noon, and there was a sudden hush in the smoky woods and hot fields on the ridges west of Gettysburg. Confederate Division Commander Harry Heath now had quite an unlooked-for mess on his hands. The easy walk into Gettysburg that he'd anticipated that morning had turned into a real train wreck, culminating in the humiliating thrashing of 2 of his brigades by Federal infantry that shouldn't have been there at all.
With considerable understatement, Heath would say in his after-action report that, quote, "The enemy had now been felt and found to be in heavy force in and around Gettysburg." Yeah, no kidding, right? His 2 brigades under Archer and Davis had been roughly handled, suffering heavy losses at the hands of Wadsworth's division of the Federal First Corps. As the shattered ranks of Archer's and Davis's brigades streamed back to Hur's Ridge, Heath sorted out his force. He rallied Davis's survivors north of the Chambersburg Pike, while lining up his 2 fresh brigades under Pettigrew and Brockenbrough to the south of the road.
Archer's battered brigade, now under the command of Colonel Burkett Fry, formed up to the right of Pettigrew. Meanwhile, Pegram's artillery continued to bang away from atop Hur's Ridge, where it was joined by several batteries from Dorsey Pender's division, bringing the total number of Confederate guns on the ridgeline to 33.
Dorsey Pender had advanced his 4 brigades up behind Heath and now they too were settling into position astride the Chambersburg Pike, back of Hers Ridge. As for Harry Heath, well, having reset his division, he now did what he should have done earlier. He waited for further orders.
For the next several hours, a lull descended across the battlefield. Abner Doubleday, who had suddenly been thrust into command of the 1st Corps when John Reynolds was killed, took advantage of this break in the action to sort out and strengthen his lines on McPherson's Ridge.
Doubleday had inherited command of the field, but had no idea about Reynolds' plans or intentions. He could only assume that Reynolds had intended to hold this position west of Gettysburg, and so Doubleday determined that he would do all he could to hold on to it.
To begin with, Doubleday reformed the Iron Brigade in the Herbst Woodlot, while Cutler led his battered regiments back into position north of the railroad cut.
Then, with the exception of a brigade of 9-month Vermont soldiers led by George Stannard, by now the rest of the 1st Corps had arrived on the field. So, dividing his own division, commanded now by Brigadier General George Rowley, Doubleday placed its 2 brigades on either side of the Iron Brigade, with Colonel Chapman Biddle's men forming to the left rear of the Black Hats on the crest of McPherson's Ridge, while Colonel Roy Stone's Pennsylvanians went into position around the McPherson farm buildings.
When it arrived, Doubleday held Brigadier General John Robinson's division back in reserve near the seminary, where some of Robinson's men began piling up earth and fence rails to form an improvised line of breastworks.
Colonel Charles Wainwright, commanding the 1st Corps artillery, also arrived on the field. Selecting good positions for his pieces, Wainwright's gunners began trading shots with the Confederate cannon over across the way on Hers Ridge. For the moment, the 1st Corps stood alone at Gettysburg, but help would soon be arriving in the form of Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps.
More Confederates would also be arriving on the field in short order, as Rhodes' division of Ewell's Corps was approaching Gettysburg from the north and will move in to occupy Oak Hill. However, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we think we'll take advantage of the lull that settled over the battlefield for several hours on the afternoon of July 1st, and use the next show to turn our attention back to the 2 Army commanders and see what was going on with Robert E. Lee and George Meade on that Wednesday morning.
As we start to bring the curtain down on this episode, we just wanted to add a postscript to the story of the capture of the 2nd Mississippi's flag. Since he still needed every able-bodied man who was with the regiment, Rufus Dawes sent the captured flag to the rear with Sergeant William Evans, who had been wounded in both thighs and was on his way into town to get medical attention. Evans didn't leave the field by ambulance or stretcher. He hobbled off using 2 muskets as crutches and tied the captured flag around his waist.
Turning once again to Harry Fans and his book Gettysburg, The First Day, Fans writes, Evans reached town and took refuge in the Jacob Hollinger house on the town's east side in the angle formed by the junction of the Hanover Road and York Pike. There, the Hollinger girls, Liberty and Julia, put him to bed. Late that afternoon, when the rebels entered the town, Evans asked the girls to hide the flag.
The girls, Fans continues, stuffed it inside his bed tick and sewed the tick shut. Evans remained until after the battle ended and the rebels had vacated the area. On the morning of July 4th, Evans somehow made his way to the 6th Wisconsin's position on Culp's Hill, where he delivered the flag to Dawes and the regiment.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Witness to Gettysburg by Richard Wheeler.
As the title suggests, this book is chock full of first-person eyewitness descriptions of the campaign and battle, and if you're particularly interested in reading such accounts, it's a good resource.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
As we released this episode on Monday, Memorial Day, we wanted to let you know that just this past weekend, we released Members Episode number 106, which is the 10th part in the story arc we've been using to tell about Jeb Stuart's ride to Gettysburg. We have one more episode to go in that story arc, so that'll make 11 episodes about Stuart's controversial journey to join the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg.
We want to thank the newest members who have signed up over on Patreon to support the podcast: Brian, Michael, Paul, Dylan, and Jesse.
Robert, John C., Rodney, Jack, David, and Mark.
Bruce, Bradley, Corey, John B., and Elizabeth.
And thanks also to Lee, Joshua, Daniel, Conan, and Andy for their donations.
And thanks to Ellen S., who made a special donation in honor of the 24th Michigan.
All right, then just a reminder that the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of every show is from the song Midnight on the Water, and we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Rich and I do hope that you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.